welcome to this new episode of our podcast Peace Today, where we talk to people all around the world who are committed to making and promoting a more peaceful world. And this is very urgent in our society today. Our world society is full of conflict and war. And today I'm very happy I can talk to Nikolaos van Dam, who is a former ambassador to mostly Muslim countries and many countries in the Middle East, among which Iraq, Egypt, Turkey, Indonesia as well, and you are also a special envoy to Syria.
Yes. And by the way, about Muslim, when I went from Turkey, from Ankara to Berlin, they said you're going to the biggest Turkish city outside Turkey.
So actually you are all Muslim countries.
Yes.
Okay. So you have been an ambassador for a very long time. You've been embedded into the Middle East, and you've got to know a lot of details that we rarely hear when we hear the news in the Netherlands. So I think that it's super valuable to hear your experiences. And I would like to start with Syria. You've written, I think, 3 books about Syria, even 4.
2 books, and then a 3rd book in which Syria is part of it. Yes.
Yeah. So over the weekend we learned about. Of course, we all know the story of how Assad regime fell, and over the weekend we were quite shocked to learn that new fights were breaking out in the very west of the country, Latakia, and apparently some remnant forces of Assad tried to create some area for their own, and there were also heavy killings as a revenge. And there were predominantly Alawites who were killed. Can you tell us a little bit about what you understand about this particular situation?
Yes. So the new regime wants to find the people who are responsible for all kinds of crimes during the Assad period. People with blood on their hands. So they, of course, and many, after the fall of the regime, who were from the Alawite mountains or from the Alawite region, they fled there in the mountains. So the military of the new regime, they came across them, and they had prepared for them a kind of, a trap. So they killed a number of regime people. When I say regime, it was the new regime people, and they took revenge. And the grudge against Alawites is very big among non-Alawites, not because all Alawites are responsible for all these troubles and all this period of the old regime, although the elite was very heavily dominated by Alawites, and the army was also dominated by Alawites, and the secret service also. But as the regime was a dictatorship by definition applies to everyone, except for an elite, which should be completely loyal. So I think a lot is revenge, and I'm not sure whether they were only the people of the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is the group of the regime, the new regime, but many others, because there are hundreds of military groups were opposition groups, and they may also have been involved. So it's this grudge against the Alawites in general, people who have been suppressed by Alawites, but perhaps by completely different Alawites. So this was unloading all kinds of aggression. So they killed many people which has nothing to do with the former regime, who were perhaps also against the former regime. And one should also take into account that the Alawite military, the people from that area, they were recruited. They were as what we could call cannon fodder. So there have been a lot of Alawite victims in the war, but in general, let's say the conservative or radical Muslims they consider Alawites as non-Muslim heretics, and you can kill heretics as you like. So one of the issues now is that even if Ahmed al-Shara has all good intentions, if you may believe him, and I believe him, because in order to have a better Syria, you have to be a little bit, have a little bit wishful thinking. But if he means what he has said, very pragmatic, tolerant things towards minorities, religious minorities and so on, this does not mean that his followers have the same thought. I mean, he may have changed from Al-Qaeda to Jabhat al-Nusra, Hayat Tahrir Sham, and to a moderate personality, outwardly in any case. But his thousands of followers, who were many of them radical Islamists, they will not have changed their thoughts. So when they can unload their aggression against people which they hate, which they think they hate, then such things happen. And it can happen again, because the grudge, if you take the Netherlands, for instance, it had taken 50 or more years before Dutch people became more favorable towards the Germans. And there was a study by Klingendahl that we don't discriminate, but we make an exception for the Germans. This was about in the 90s. So this is far from solved. And also, Ahmed al-Shara, he doesn't have the whole of Syria under control. There is it's a spectacular development. Yesterday there was an agreement between the new regime and the Syrian Democratic Forces, which are the forces dominated by the Kurds in the northeast. I hadn't expected that to happen, but of course they have a time to implement it of a year, and a lot can happen in a year, of course.
But actually then you're also saying that al-Jarrah doesn't really control all of his forces, and whatever he promised, he maybe cannot deliver.
This is a big dilemma, and then he's not the only one. His group is not the only group who has been responsible for toppling the regime. There are many others. The Free Syrian Army, or now it has a different name, in the north, militias which were supported by Turkey, for instance, they also participated. So they want, of course, to claim a share in power. And even if it were just HTS, Hayat Tahrir Sham people, they may think completely different from what he thinks. So,
but how stable is the situation then, in fact?
It's very unstable. And there are people in Europe, for instance, who think, and the Americans also, that one should maintain the sanctions. But I think, well, in the first place, usually the sanctions don't work. There are a few exceptions, South Africa, for instance, but that's a completely different situation. And Syria is in rubble. More than 500,000 people dead, more than 12 million people refugees. If you take, let's say, the outskirts of Damascus, completely in ruins. Many other cities, also in the countryside, in ruins. So people don't realize what it means that you live in ruins, without water, without the main necessities. They think, well, we should build off slowly and lift the sanctions. But to rise from the ashes in such a difficult situation, you make it more difficult by not lifting the sanctions, and which means if people are already hungry, there was a euphoria that Assad had fallen and had fled. But how long is euphoria last? It is already 3 months ago, and they still are without enough food. I think 90% of the population is under the what they call the subsistence level. And there's a recent report by the UNDP that it will take until 2080, which is from now 55 years, until Syria is back on the level where it was, economically speaking, in 2011. That started. So,
if we continue on this.
If we continue this, if it's peaceful, so the chance is very big that there will be renewed troubles, because people who don't have enough to eat, it's very simple. They want to have money, so they will embezzle, or they will put people under pressure and so on. To control this is an enormous task.
Yes. I would first like to ask maybe a big question and then continue on this topic because I'm also interested in how the West is sort of involved in this. But maybe you've written this book, Struggle for Power.
Yes.
How should we actually understand Syria? Because how did it come about, and how does it still sort of the origins of Syria still play a role in the way things operate in Syria?
Syria is sometimes described as a mosaic of all kinds of different groups, religious groups, ethnic groups, and it used to be described as an ideal thing, a peaceful mosaic. But you could also describe it in a different way. You have all these stones making up the mosaic, but it is being held by cement, but the cement is in fact a total authoritarian system. So if you lift the authoritarian element, all groups compete for power, and then the stones are still there, but after, like now there has been war since 2011, which is 14 years almost, the stones are different. So before the Ba'ath Party took over power in 1963, the Sunni people, I should better say, people from Sunni origin, mainly from the cities, the bourgeoisie, the better off, they ruled the country. When the Ba'ath Party came to power, they were mainly people from minorities and from the countryside. Why? Because for the minorities, the Ba'ath ideology was attractive, because it's a secular ideology in which all groups are supposed to be equal, whether they are Alawi or Sunni and so on. At the same time, it was the minorities lived mainly in the countryside. And then also it was a socialist party, so also poor people from the countryside, they felt attracted to it. So when they took over power in Damascus and everywhere, they dismissed all kinds of people from the army, mainly Sunni people, and replaced them by their own people, the people from minorities, and particularly the Alawis. Alawis, not the Alawis, so family members from their tribes, from their village and so on. And they had a priority of power over anything else, over ideology. You can say you can only implement your ideology if you have power. But once you have power, you can become corrupt. So what they did, until a certain time, they were still practicing their ideology. There was an internal power struggle, and one eliminating the other. In the end, there was only one king or one Shah. That was Hafez al-Assad in 1970, and he was the only one. So from that time on, there was stability, but stability linked to dictatorship. And opening the regime to others would mean, most probably, if not certainly, that he would sign his own end. And that's perhaps putting it simplistically, but that's in fact what happened. So he didn't want to share power, and his son, when Hafez al-Assad died, his son Bashar, he did the same thing. There were some discussions after he took off power, people discussing. They called it the Damascene, what was it, the Damascene Spring or something like that. There were discussions, but they didn't tolerate, because they thought if they have more democracy, then they have also a say in politics, then it will be our end. I think that it can hardly be different. If you have a dictatorship, one person in power, and he allows others to speak with him, then at a certain moment he will have to disappear. And this is so. It's also the same with Arab unity. All these Arab nationalists, they were very true Arab nationalists, but one thing, only with themselves in power. That's why all kinds of Arab plans to make unity, for instance, between Syria and Iraq, they all failed, because Saddam Hussein, he wanted to be in power. He wanted unity with Syria, but only with him the boss. And the other way around, Hafez al-Assad wanted fervently cooperation with Iraq, unity, but no shared leadership. That didn't work.
Yeah, often there's pointed to this so-called Arab weakness. That is you can also see the way they react now to what is happening in Gaza. It's actually very weak, and some people point to some kind of inherent Arabic thing. But isn't it also because a lot of these leaders, also Saddam, was also being manipulated by other interests in order to?
I think their ideas are good, but in the end, they have become more and more realistic or pragmatic because they cannot beat Israel. So they are powerless, in fact. And Israel wants to dominate the whole Arab world. So for instance, now they have, when the regime in Syria, Assad regime fell, they were depleting the whole military capacity of Syria.
It's still going on.
It is still going on. They are even occupying extra parts. They're not threatened at all because the Syrians are don't have any force to do anything. And by the way, also, Hafez al-Assad and later on, I think half a century long, there has not been fired one shot across the Golan. And if there has been, it is perhaps by accident. So they are not at all a threat. There was a slogan, Assad means lion. And so in Lebanon, you would find on the walls graffiti, Assad, he's a lion in Lebanon, but a rabbit in the Golan. Assad fi Lebanon wa Arnab fil Jolan. So he is wise enough that if he would attack Israel, he will be completely destroyed, as happened with other people. So they can make declarations, they can unite all their armed forces, but they are not really a serious party against Israel. And you see also a new development. Israel is promoting the idea, and it's a misconception, it's that they can protect the Druze in Syria. In the south of Syria, you have an area called the Jabal al-Arab, the mountain of the Arabs, formerly called the mountain of the Druzes. They are among the most fervent Arab nationalists. They don't want anything to do with, they don't want to have anything to do with Israel. But Israel is promoting the idea, we can protect them. We can protect the other, we can protect the Alawis, for instance, if they are now threatened by this regime. We support the independence of Kurdistan in Iraq. There was when Masoud Barzani was having this referendum. He wanted, in fact, a bigger area for Kurdistan. There was also an Israeli present. It's not because they like them, it's just power politics. Because the idea of Israel, and this is not new, it is already as long as Israel exists. Israel, you could call it an ethno-religious entity. So it is so-called ethnicity. You can discuss whether it's but anyhow, this is the perception is an ethnicity. These are the Jews with a certain religion, which is Judaism. So you have, for instance, the Kurds. They are an entity. Or you have the Alawites, you have the Druzes, and so on. So if the Middle East would be, you have even maps where from 50 years ago, in a book, for instance, called The Second Arab Awakening of John Kimche, a Zionist writer from Switzerland. So he had a map indicating the Druze neutral zone, the Kurdish neutral zone, and so on. So this is an idea they promote, and the Western media, they simply copy it, thinking, oh, the Israelis want to protect minorities. But of course, they are not the least interested in protecting anyone except for their own people. And I'm not talking about the Israeli people, because there is no Israeli people, but the Jewish people, the Israeli Jewish, because they don't care about, for instance, the Palestinian Christians, because then if you choose between what are the Palestinian Christians, they're Arabs. Well, they happen to be Christians, but in this respect, they are against the Arabs. So this is creating an extra source of high instability, and also creating a sectarian strife. So people,
if you promote one people over the others.
Yes. Yeah. So then if you make it people want to survive in general, just to stay alive, not only survive but stay alive. So when someone is supposedly helping them, for instance, the Israelis also wanted to have an alliance with the Maronite Christians in Lebanon. But President Bashir al-Jumayr, he wanted to be the president of all Lebanese, so he didn't want that.
But they got help in the 80s from the Phalange people who were also sort of coerced to join into anti-Palestinian hatred.
Yeah, exactly. So the Phalange, the Kataib of Jumayr, they were against the Palestinians. They had a conflict with the Lebanese Druze, also, by the way, Arab nationalists. But so they play what for them, for the Israelis, its most favorable situation is the weakness of all parties around. And they succeeded to a great extent. So, but this doesn't mean that there can be any peace. The possibilities, if there was already a possibility for peace for Israel and the Palestinians, but also with the Arabs, it is by day the possibilities for peace are less, because all this violence, all this these war crimes, if you have, let's say, one, you cannot express the numbers. If you have one crime, okay, but if you have hundreds, thousands of war crimes, how can you have peace? We have seen in Europe that after the Second World War there was peace. But that was also peace based on that Germany, the Nazis had been defeated, and there was
strong
peace.
Power of the US. Yeah.
But it took tens of years before people adapting to the idea that the Germans, the democratic Germans, are our friends and allies. So this idea of, for instance, if you take, there was peace between Israel, a peace treaty after Camp David in 1979. So this is more than 45 years. Well, there's no war, but there's not a peace in the sense of feeling peace. For instance, the Israelis are not welcome at the Cairo International Book Fair. I mean, it's something very simple. They don't want them because they see every day all these war crimes. So it is, you can see there's no war in various areas. Although there's war in Lebanon, there's war in Syria. I mean, the Israelis involving there. They have attacked Iran and so on. But to have peace so for instance, now in Syria, the new regime wants to prosecute the war criminals. So what happens to the Israeli war criminals? Are they all of a sudden nice people and so on? No, of course not. So this will, even if, like, what you have the Abraham Accords. Yes. Under American pressure. So, for instance, they have Abraham Accords. It is the United Arab Emirates. You have Sudan. You have Morocco. You have, I've certainly forgot another country. So, for instance, Sudan was on the terrorist list. And so the Americans said, well, if you make peace with Israel, then you get a lot of money and you are no longer terrorists. I mean, for instance, if you look at Morocco, they annexed the Western Sahara. So the Americans said, well, if you make peace with Israel, recognize, so we don't, you can annex it and so on. So it's a kind of what we call in Dutch horse trade. You give something, but it doesn't mean that there's peace based on any kinds of feelings.
Yeah, yeah. So that will exist for a long time. I'm interested, the way the lines have been drawn on the map have been are coming from the colonial era of the Western powers, France and England, Great Britain. So how did the Western regimes, the Western governments, influence, how were the relations during the Ba'athist period? Because to us it's also quite unclear. It's obvious that they had good relations with the Soviets, but there was a time that Assad was also welcome in London with his wife, and there seemed to be sort of good relations. And so I'm wondering, how did the relations of the West develop with regards to Syria, and how does it look now? I mean, what are the Western projects for this whole area at the moment?
Well, in first place, this what we call the Fertile Crescent area, which is the Ottoman, when it was the Ottoman Empire, there were no borders in that area. So by which I mean Mesopotamia and Greater Syria. So the Western power, France and Britain, they divided it. So artificial borders were created. In the past, in the Ottoman times, you could travel from Damascus to Jerusalem or from Beirut to Jerusalem, no problem. There were no borders. So with the new boundaries, also new identities started to develop. Although first you had the Arab identity, but the longer these colonial entities or entities imposed by colonial powers state, for instance Syria, the more there was, instead of an Arab identity, a Syrian identity. But for instance, in the beginning, shortly after independence, the Americans, they organized a coup. So in 1949, it was the first military coup. They had later on, this is outside the Arab world, in Iran, the Mossadegh, they organized a coup and so on. So the Western influence has been quite destructive. It has also, for instance, in Palestine, with the British mandate, there were all kinds of Arab protests against the Jewish immigration. Like, for instance, now certain political parties in the Netherlands, they are against immigration, and they are the most in favor of Israel. So there was in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, there were protests and missions, and also they all concluded that the Palestinian Arabs don't want this immigration, and they don't want their country to be overtaken by foreigners, in this case Jews from Europe mainly. So, and the British simply left, and then in 1948, at the end of their mandate. So the relations between European countries and Syria have not been very good. In fact, they have been very bad. Even if there was, for instance, visits of President Bashar al-Assad to France, to Britain, and so on, this doesn't mean that they were really friends. One should say also that at the beginning of the regime of Bashar al-Assad from 2000, the idea was, I mentioned already Damascene Spring, there was an idea that there was going to be reform. And one had the idea that Bashar al-Assad, he had been educated for some time as an eye doctor in Britain. They thought, in fact quite naively, that it would have influenced his thinking, democracy and so on. Well, we know that just as a side step, the Western countries, they want democracy, except if it develops into something which they don't like. Then all of a sudden, elections don't count. We have many examples in Algeria, and the Hamas, in other cases. So, but of course, Bashar was educated in Syria, in the surroundings of his father, of his family, of the army, so he was a son of Syria, not of England. It is very naive that if you spend somewhere a year and a half, that all of a sudden your personality is completely changing. And you have also to take into account the reality of your own country. So there was some optimism. I think this was also the period that he visited Britain and France. But later on, because people tried to topple him, he reacted in a very extreme way. And this, one might say that the younger generation, since they hadn't experienced the atrocities of the regime in the early 1980s, Hamas, 30,000 dead, there, the Muslim Brotherhood, they made a revolution, and they had to pay dearly, but not only them, but the whole population of Hamas. A little bit similarly to what happened now in the coastal area, but the other way around. So relations were, I would say, very meager, or not even bad. For instance, the Syrians, they wanted a kind of, what do you call it, association treaty with the European Union, like other countries in the Middle East have it. No, like Israel has one, and other countries. But it went wrong when it was about human rights. And there you see also, let's say, the double, triple, multiple standards, or double standards. The Syrians didn't want to submit to the criteria of human rights, thinking that another country, their neighboring country, Israel, they got away with violating all kinds of human rights by its existence, because Israel's based on ethnic cleansing and so on. So in this case, even if there would have been theoretically, if there would have been an association treatment between Syria and the EU, I'm sure that Syria would have been punished, and it would have been frozen or abolished. But in the case of Israel, war crime, it doesn't matter. They have the right to defend themselves, so-called, but they're not really threatened. The Palestinians, there is, in a way, put it between quotation marks, a nuisance for them, but they're not a threat to them, not at all to their existence. So the relations with the Middle Eastern countries were, I would say in general, bad. Perhaps there are a few exceptions, Lebanon and Jordan and Egypt.
But how do you see the West now trying to influence what's happening in Syria? And are there any projects for Syria to, I mean, you've already mentioned what Israel would like. They would like to have these enclaves of different ethno-religious unities, the Kurds, Alawites, Druze, etc. Is there any Western plan now? And is Al-Jarrah listening to that, or is he involved in that? Or are there Turkish plans for Syria? What plans are being implemented now, do you think?
Well, one of the main issues is to rebuild Syria from the rubble. And even if you would have all materials and all the money, you cannot rebuild it it will take half a century at least. Because it's not only, if I have the stones, it doesn't mean I can build a house. I need someone who can build a house. So that the capabilities, the capacity for that is very small. So rebuilding in order to recreate wealth or to get above the level of minimum, I think that is the main plan.
That's the main plan. So keep Syria as a whole, or do you fear Syria falling apart?
I don't see Syria falling apart. You have always declarations by politicians, by countries, that the integrity of Syria. That's all. But having those declarations doesn't always mean that it is the real plan. Like, for instance, many states say the two-state solution. But is it really their plan? Do they want to put pressure on Israel to help it achieve? No, it's just a declaration. But as we have seen during the civil war from 2011 until 2014, many countries have interfered in Syria with completely divergent interests. Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the United States, Turkey, Russia, Iran, and so on. So there was a book by Patrick Seal. It's called The Struggle for Syria, which the message was all these countries struggle for Syria. They wanted to have influence. Then later on, he published a second book, Assad, The Struggle for the Middle East. So Syria was in power, Assad was in power, so it was not any one other country trying to dominate him, although some did try to, but he tried to dominate other countries like Lebanon, like Iraq, and so on. And this is now again back to... So every country has its own interests. So like you have, for instance, Arab countries who have supported all kinds of opposition groups. Interesting is that hardly anyone has supported HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, except at a certain stage Qatar supported Jabhat al-Nusra, the predecessor. They said they stopped it. So what is wisdom? If they would be wise enough, in my opinion at least, they should give Ahmed al-Shara, his regime, a chance. Because, and this applies also to sanctions, if you make it more difficult, it will be more difficult for him to ever get out of this mess. So nevertheless, several countries, including Turkey, of course, as a neighboring country, wants to influence. They want to have a share in rebuilding Syria and so on. So I don't think there's really a plan. The plan is to rebuild Syria, and for many European countries say, well, we want democracy. But as I mentioned, it depends on who will be the chosen, not the chosen people, but the chosen regime. So you have now 4 years, after 4 years there will be elections, there's supposed to be elections, but in that meantime, Ahmed al-Sharaa may have consolidated his party, and he may have 90%, 99% of the votes, because he can do as the other dictatorship. But hopefully this is not I hope, but it would be quite realistic to suggest that the Syrians have also, after this very, very bad experience, they realize that they must rebuild their country, and they must make compromises. They must avoid the possibility for a renewed civil war, or I could even say a continued civil war, because the war has not fully ended yet.
Now, it looks like the options are between two evils. Let's say a dictatorship based on minority rule, let's say, that has the Ba'athist Party is done, and then another dictatorship based on the majority, and the Sunni majority, let's say, which is now trying, could develop, let's say.
Yes, but here I should add that the Ba'ath Party, the Ba'ath regime, was a minority within the Alawi minority, to put it a little bit simplistic. So now you have HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. They are a small minority from within the majority, which means that an authoritarian system is by definition always a minority, always. So that's why it's wrong to define it as majorities or minorities.
Okay, I see. It's always minorities.
Like, for instance, they would say in Iraq that the Sunnis dominated the Shias, because Saddam happened to be from the north, from the Sunni area. But in reality, it was a dictatorship, and he was just from a small area, Tikrit and surroundings. So these were the elite. But even people from those villages, if they would not fully support them, they could get killed. Could get killed.
Absolutely right. That's a good remark. So I would like to. This is a very fascinating history, and all things that are still in flux. Let's say we don't know what's going to happen. And as you said, your hope is for the Syrians themselves to realize that war is no option. I saw an interview with a Druze leader who actually said the same thing. We will defend themselves, they said, but we want to avoid war at all costs, let's say. But my final questions, I think, are about what are these developments, what will these developments have for influence on the conflict in Israel-Palestine? And especially how will it influence the position of the Palestinians? So first that question.
So the Arab world is divided, even if they are unified on the aims. The aim is to have a Palestinian state, but they cannot enforce it. They are too weak. And the alliance between the United States and Israel is many, many times stronger than, for instance, between the United States and Saudi Arabia. So it looks very pessimistic, but I expect Israel just to continue as long as they can, and they have the power, they have the forces. There's Europe.
Expect them to stay in Syria as well?
I'm sorry?
Do you expect them to stay in Syria?
Oh yes, they have been there now since 1967. Well, you can calculate how many years that is. So, and they have expanded their territory. And during the 1973 war, and then they have expanded now again. They don't want to withdraw from Lebanon, so they're, irrespective of violating all kinds of international laws continually, they are They have no intention to withdraw because nobody is able or willing to force them.
So this has actually been a net loss for the Palestinians again.
It is very bad because the Israelis want to have from the river to the sea, a slogan which in the Netherlands is being criticized if others say it. It's in their official program of the Likud party already since 1977 or something like that. So as long as they get away with it, so they will continue to ethnically cleansing. I think cleansing, I find it because it's not cleaner, but anyhow, the opposition, the opposite of cleansing is pollution, but anyhow, ethnic cleansing, they are getting away with it, and they only get some criticism, that's all.
How serious do you take Trump's words about the Riviera in Gaza and actually removing the whole population?
It is criminal, but also stupid. Criminality and stupidity sometimes are combined, and this is a good combination of both.
Is he serious about it, or is it just bluff like he also can?
Well, he's a man of trades, horse trading, so to say. It's the second time I use this word. So he has not much. His lobby around him is very much pro-Israel. Mm-hmm. So they feed this idea, and in that sense, he is serious, except that he finds all Arab countries against it. So it is serious enough to
that he says it.
Think that he is serious about it. But the Americans say it, Trump says it, but the Israelis say it also. It's their idea already, people who want even much more than just Palestine, Golan, they want, there are people
Lebanon.
talking about from Lebanon, they want from the Euphrates to the Nile, from the river to the river, so to say. So if it would be other countries, if it would not be Jews, because people are sensitive about Jews, then if it would be Syria or Russia or what, then the relations would be broken off, trade relations, no banking traffic, forbidding any Israeli to step to enter Europe, and so on and so on. Sanctions, sanctions, sanctions. But instead of sanctions, sometimes the relations are being expanded.
How long can this go on? Because, especially also for Europe, there's no rational reason why we would support a state like that.
The strange thing is that if we look at economic interests, and this is not now, but already, not only now, but already for many years longer, that economic interests are much more with the Arab world, rich Arab countries, than with Israel. But it is the feelings, the emotions that people are more with Israel. If you look at in the Netherlands, for instance, if you read the media, not just social media, but papers, what I call good papers, you can read everything about this conflict. And I think many people have been influenced by it, but it doesn't. There is no translation into politics.
No, that's very strange. There's about 3 parliamentarians in the 150 who are critical about Israel, and that's not among the population. So how come?
One thing is, politicians talk as politicians. They think about their electorate, and they're not analyzing a situation from the realistic point of view, but they analyze it how they think their voters would be influenced by them. But I think there will be a change, because the younger generation is much more open to, for instance, criticism of Israel, and there's all reason to be critical. So their lobby is very strong, much stronger than the Arab lobby in the United States, in Europe, and so on. But I think there will be a possibility. Also, for instance, many people with a migration background, they're not burdened by this idea that you never can criticize a Jew because they have been prosecuted. But having been prosecuted doesn't mean that you are free to commit crimes against others. But nevertheless, there is a big blind spot
But do you really feel it's based on emotion, or is it fear? Because
it's emotion and fear for the lobby of Israel. They're still sensitive to all this trick. You can call it trick. Everyone is anti-Semite. If you are against war crimes by Israel, then you're an anti-Semite, and so to put it simply. So there is, I thought, after the 1967 war, which is a long time ago, there's going to be a change. Yeah. And there was a change, because in the newspapers, in the media, there were many more critical voices and more. If you look at a bookshop, go in any good bookshop, you find all kinds of books about Palestinian history. You have, of course, also books about Israeli history, or pro-Israel books, but also many books which 100 years of Palestine, many books. Mm-hmm. So it is available, but it is not enough to convince, perhaps to convince people, but to change the political realities.
Thank you. So we're already talking quite a long time, but the last thing I would like to close off with then is what do we do about this? And especially also you talking about the lobby being very strong. How to deal with that, and how to deal with those fears that you may be being blamed for being anti-Semite, or, I think a lot of people, I think the majority finds it horrible what's happening. There are really, and I'm also surprised by that, people who really enjoy the killings, etc. And you see that on
sadistic.
It's sadistic. Yes. You have them, and I was myself horrified to discover that there is this genocidal element in our society as well. But I would still say that the majority rejects this kind of violence. But how to make them speak up?
Well, in French you say frapper toujours, keep beating, and that's the only way. And just a detail, the Francesca Albanese, she was, I think she's doing an excellent job. She was, the parliament refused, the Foreign Relations Commission refused to talk to her. Actually, they helped her a lot, because they refused to talk to her, she has gotten perhaps 100 times more attention for her views. So you should continue, and not being afraid of this, of all these kinds of accusations. Because
intimidation.
Yes, so if you're not sensitive to that intimidation, I think you can achieve.
Have you dealt with that yourself? Intimidation?
I have now and then they try to intimidate it, but I'm hardly ever intimidated, probably because they know I'm not sensitive to it, and I will simply continue. But if they would feel, it's like, if they would feel like a dog, if they feels you're afraid, he will bite you. If he feels you're not afraid, he will go aside.
So we shouldn't be afraid for those who want to promote this violence and to promote an ideology in society that is.
And what also is important, to apply objective standards. Mm-hmm. So something is a war crime or not. Yeah. So if you apply objective standards of international law, you couldn't criticize that. I mean, but still, it's being criticized. But that is the simple thing to do, objective standards.
Well, a final thing then. The absurd thing is that the people who are in the streets, they are not demanding something very absurd. They're demanding their international law to be followed and applied. They're demanding our own laws to be applied. And if you look to Germany, to the UK, increasingly the UK, demonstrators who are asking for for the internationally recognized law to be recognized, to be applied, they're being beaten in the streets.
Yes,
it's quite absurd.
That's right. So that's all these international rules have been achieved with a lot of difficulty. And these are all undermined, particularly by the United States and Israel. And that's very dangerous, because if one party ignores it, others start to ignore it as well, and then they go all together down the drain. Yeah.
So if you have one last word for all those who want to see a change and to see this international law being applied equally without the double standards that you've been talking about, what would your final message to?
Well, take some distance and have a look at the wider picture, and be responsible, feel responsibility also that the rules which have been achieved with so much difficulty that they will be applied. If you don't, then the big chance is that a big war is coming.
Thank you so much, Nikolaos van Dam.
With pleasure. Thank you.